Chapter 7. Ashima sits at the kitchen table on Pemberton Road, addressing Christmas cards. A cup of Lipton tea grows slowly cold by her hand. 3 different address books are open before her, along with some calligraphy pens she has found in the desk drawer in Gogol's room, and the stack of cards, and a bit of dampened sponge to seal the envelopes with. The oldest of the address books, bought 28 years ago at a stationery store in Harvard Square, has a pebbly black cover and blue pages, bound together by a rubber band. The other 2 are larger, prettier, and alphabetical tabs still intact. One has a padded dark green cover and pages edged in gilt. Her favorite, a birthday gift from Gogol, features paintings that hang in the Museum of Modern Art. On the end papers of all these books are phone numbers corresponding to no one, and the 800 numbers of all the airlines they have flown back and forth to Calcutta, and reservation numbers, and her ballpoint doodles as she was kept on hold. Having 3 separate address books makes her current task a bit complicated, but Ashima does not believe in crossing out names or consolidating them into a single book. She prides herself on each entry in each volume, for together they form a record of all the Bengalis she and Ashok have known over the years, all the people she has had the fortune to share rice with in a foreign land. She remembers the day she bought the oldest book, soon after arriving in America, one of her first trips out of the apartment, without Ashok at her side. The $5 bill in her purse feeling like a fortune. She remembers selecting the smallest and cheapest style, saying, "I would like to buy this one, please," as she placed the item on the counter, her heart pounding for fear that she would not be understood. The salesperson had not even glanced at her, had said nothing other than the price. She had come back to the apartment and written into the book's blank blue pages her parents' address in Calcutta, on Amherst Street, and then her in-laws in Alipur, and finally her own, the apartment in Central Square, so that she would remember it. She had written in Ashok's extension at MIT, conscious of writing his name for the first time in her life, writing his last name as well. That had been her world. She had made her own Christmas cards this year, an idea she picked up from a book in the crafts section of the library. Normally, she buys boxes of cards marked 50% off at department stores in January, always forgetting, by the following winter, exactly where in the house she had put them. She is careful to choose ones that say Happy Holidays or Season's Greetings, as opposed to Merry Christmas, to avoid angels or nativity scenes in favor of what she considers firmly secular images. A sleigh being pulled through a snow-covered field, or skaters on a pond. This year's card is a drawing she has done herself, of an elephant decked with red and green jewels, glued onto silver paper. The elephant is a replica of a drawing her father had done for Gogol over 27 years ago, in the margins of an aerogram. She has saved her dead parents' letters on top shelf of her closet, in a large white purse she used to carry in the 70s until the strap broke. Once a year she dumps the letters onto her bed and goes through them, devoting an entire day to her parents' words, allowing herself a good cry. She revisits their affection and concern, conveyed weekly, faithfully, across continents. All the bits of news that had had nothing to do with her life in Cambridge, but which had sustained her in those days nevertheless. Her ability to reproduce the elephant has surprised her. She has not drawn a thing since she was a child, has assumed she had long forgotten what her father had once taught her, and what her son has inherited about holding the pen with confidence and making bold, swift strokes. She spent a whole day redoing the drawing on different sheets of paper, coloring it in, trimming it to size, taking it to the university copy center. For an entire evening, she had driven herself to different stationery stores in the town, looking for red envelopes that the cards would fit into. She has time to do things like this now that she is alone, now that there is no one to feed or entertain or talk to for weeks at a time. At 48, she has come to experience the solitude that her husband and son and daughter already know, and which they claim not to mind. It's not such a big deal, her children tell her. Everyone should live on their own at some point. But Ashima feels too old to learn such a skill. She hates returning in the evenings to a dark, empty house, going to sleep on one side of the bed and waking up on another. At first, she was wildly industrious, cleaning out closets and scrubbing the insides of kitchen cupboards and scraping the shelves off the refrigerator, rinsing out the vegetable bins. In spite of the security system, she would sit up startled in the middle of the night by a sound somewhere in the house, or the rapid taps that travelled through the baseboard when heat flowed through the pipes. For nights on end, she would double-check all the window locks, making sure that they were fastened tightly. There was the night she had been roused by a repetitive banging outside the front door and called Ashok in Ohio. With the cordless phone pressed to her ear, she had gone downstairs and looked through the peephole, and when she had finally opened the door, she saw that it was only the screen door, which she had forgotten to latch, swinging wildly in the wind. Now she does the laundry once a month. She no longer dusts, or notices dust, for that matter. She eats on the sofa, in front of the television, simple meals of buttered toast and dal, a single pot lasting her a week, and an omelette to go with it if she has the energy to bother. Sometimes she eats the way Gogol and Sonia do when they visit, standing in front of the refrigerator, not bothering to heat up the food in the oven or to put it in a plate. Her hair is thinning, graying, still parted in the middle, worn in a bun instead of a braid. She has been fitted for bifocals recently, and they hang against the folds of her sari on a chain around her neck. 3 afternoons a week and 2 Saturdays a month, she works at the public library, just as Sonia had done when she was in high school. It is Ashima's first job in America, the first since before she was married. She signs her small paychecks over to Ashok, and he deposits them for her at the bank into their account. She works at the library to pass the time. She has been going regularly for years, taking her children to story hour when they were young and checking out magazines and books of knitting patterns for herself. And one day, Mrs. Buxton, the head librarian, asked if she would be interested in a part-time position. At first, her responsibilities were the same as those of the high school girls, shelving the books that people returned, making sure that sections of shelves were in precise alphabetical order, sometimes running a feather duster along the spines. She mended old books, put protective covers on new arrivals, organized monthly displays on subjects such as gardening, presidential biographies, poetry, African American history. Lately, she has begun to work at the main desk, greeting the regular patrons by name as they walk through the doors, filling out forms for interlibrary loans. She is friendly with the other women who work at the library, most of them also with grown children. A number of them live alone, as Ashima does now, because they are divorced. They are the first American friends she has made in her life. Over tea in the staff room, they gossip about the patrons, about the perils of dating in middle age. On occasion, she has her library friends over to the house for lunch, goes shopping with them on weekends to outlet stores in Maine. Every 3 weekends, her husband comes home. He arrives by taxi, though she is willing to drive herself around their town. She is not willing to get on the highway and drive to Logan. When her husband is in the house, she shops and cooks as she used to. If there is a dinner invitation at friends, they go together, driving along the highway without the children, sadly aware that Gogol and Sonia, now both grown, will never sit with them in the back seat again. During his visits, Ashok keeps his clothes in his suitcase, his shaving things in a bag by the sink. He does the things she still doesn't know how to do. He pays all the bills and rakes the leaves on the lawn and puts gas from the self-service station into her car. His visits are too short to make a difference, and within hours, it seems, Sunday comes, and she is on her own again. When they are apart, they speak by phone every night at 8 o'clock. Sometimes, not knowing what to do with herself after dinner, she is already in bed by then, in her nightgown, watching the small black and white television they have owned for decades, that lives on her side of the bed. The picture gradually disappearing, a rim of black perpetually framing the screen. If there is nothing decent on television, she leaves through books she takes out of the library books that occupy the space Ashok normally does on the bed. Now it is 3 in the afternoon, the sun's strength already draining from the sky. It is the sort of day that seems to end minutes after it begins, defeating Ashima's intentions to spend it fruitfully, the inevitability of nightfall distracting her, the sort of day when Ashima craves her dinner by 5. It's one of the things she has always hated about life here. These chilly, abbreviated days of early winter, darkness descending mere hours after noon. She expects nothing of days such as this, simply waits for them to end. She is resigned to warming dinner for herself in a little while, changing into her nightgown, switching on the electric blanket on her bed. She takes a sip of her tea, now stone cold. She gets up to refill the kettle, make another cup. The petunias in her window box, planted Memorial Day weekend, the last time Gogol and Sonia were home together, have withered to shuddering brown stalks that she has been meaning for weeks to root from the soil. Ashok will do it, she thinks to herself, and when the phone rings and her husband says hello, this is the first thing she tells him. She hears noises in the background, people speaking. "Are you watching the television?" she asks him. "I'm in the hospital," he tells her. "What happened?" She turns off the whistling kettle, startled, her chest tightening, terrified that he has been in some sort of accident. "My stomach's been bothering me since morning," he tells Ashima. It's probably something he has eaten, that he had been invited the previous evening to the home of some Bengali students he had met in Cleveland, who are still teaching themselves to cook, where he was subjected to a suspicious-looking chicken biryani. She exhales audibly, relieved that it's nothing serious. "So take an Alka-Seltzer." "I did. It didn't help. I just came to the emergency room because all the doctors' offices are closed today." "You're working too hard. You're no longer a student, you know. I hope you're not getting an ulcer," she says. "No, I hope not." "Who drove you there?" "No one. I'm here on my own." "Really, it's not that bad." Nevertheless, she feels a wave of sympathy for him at the thought of him driving to the hospital alone. She misses him suddenly, remembers afternoons years ago when they had first moved to this town, when he would surprise her and come home from university in the middle of the day. They would indulge in a proper Bengali lunch instead of sandwiches they had gotten used to by then, boiling rice and warming the previous night's leftovers, filling their stomachs, sitting and talking at the table, sleepy and sated, as their palms turned yellow and dry. "What does the doctor say?" she asks Ashok now. "I'm waiting to see him. It's a rather long wait. Do me one thing." "What?" "Call Dr. Sandler tomorrow. I'm due for a physical anyway. Make an appointment for me next Saturday." if he has an opening. All right. Don't worry, I'm feeling better already. I'll call you when I get home. All right. She hangs up the phone, prepares her tea, returns to the table. She writes, "Call Dr. Sandler" on one of the red envelopes, propping it up against the salt and pepper shakers. She takes a sip of tea and winces, detecting a faint film of dishwashing liquid on this section of the rim, chiding herself for being careless about rinsing. She wonders if she ought to call Gogol and Sonia to tell them that their father is in the hospital. But quickly she reminds herself that he is not technically in the hospital, that if this were any other day but Sunday, he'd be at a doctor's office having an ordinary checkup. He had spoken to her normally, sounding a bit tired perhaps, but not in great pain. And so she returns to her project. At the bottom of the cards, over and over, she signs their names. Her husband's name, which she has never once uttered in his presence, followed by her own, and then the names of her children, Gogol and Sonia. She refuses to write Nikhil, even though she knows that's what he would prefer. No parent ever called a child by his good name. Good names had no place within a family. She writes the names one below the other, in order of age: Ashok, Ashima, Gogol, Sonia. She decides to send a card to each of them, shifting the respective name to the top of the card. To her husband's apartment in Cleveland, to Gogol in New York, adding Maxine's name too. Though she had been polite enough the one time Gogol had brought Maxine to the house, Ashima doesn't want her for a daughter-in-law. She had been startled that Maxine had addressed her as Ashima, and her husband as Ashok. And yet Gogol has been dating her for over a year now. By now, Ashima knows that Gogol spends his nights with Maxine, sleeping under the same roof as her parents, a thing Ashima refuses to admit to her Bengali friends. He even has his number there. She had called it once, listening to the voice of the woman who must be Maxine's mother, not leaving any message. She knows the relationship is something she must be willing to accept. Sonia has told her this, and so have her American friends at the library. She addresses a card to Sonia and the two girlfriends she lives with in San Francisco. Ashima looks forward to Christmas, the four of them being together. It still bothers her that neither Gogol nor Sonia has come home for Thanksgiving this year. Sonia, who is working for an environmental agency and studying for her LSAT, had said it was too far to travel. Gogol, who had to work the following day because of a project at his firm, had spent the holiday with Maxine's family in New York. Having been deprived of the company of her own parents upon moving to America, her children's independence, their need to keep their distance from her, is something she will never understand. Still, she had not argued with them. This, too, she is beginning to learn. She had complained to her friends at the library, and they had told her it was inevitable, that eventually Parents had to stop assuming that their children would return faithfully for the holidays. And so, she and Ashok had spent Thanksgiving together, not bothering, for the first time in years, to buy a turkey. Love, Ma, she writes now at the bottom of the cards to her children. And at the bottom of one for Ashok, simply Ashima. She passes over 2 pages filled only with the addresses of her daughter, and then her son. She has given birth to vagabonds. She is the keeper of all these names and numbers. Now, numbers she once knew by heart. Numbers and addresses her children no longer remember. She thinks of all the dark, hot apartments Gogol has inhabited over the years, beginning with his first dorm room in New Haven, and now the apartment in Manhattan with the peeling radiator and cracks in the walls. Sonia has done the same as her brother, a new room every year since she was 18. New roommates Ashima must keep track of when she calls. She thinks of her husband's apartment in Cleveland, which she had helped him settle into one weekend when she visited. She had bought him inexpensive pots and plates, the kind she used back in Cambridge, as opposed to the gleaming ones from Williams Sonoma her children buy for her these days as gifts. Sheets and towels, some sheer curtains for the windows, a big sack of rice. In her own life, Ashima has lived in only 5 houses. Her parents' flat in Calcutta, her in-laws' house for 1 month, the house they rented in Cambridge, living below the Montgomerys, the faculty apartment on campus, and lastly, the one they own now. One hand, 5 homes, a lifetime in a fist. From time to time she looks out the window at the lilac sky of early evening, vividly tinged with 2 parallel stripes of pink. She looks up at the phone on the wall, wishing it would ring. She will buy her husband a cell phone for Christmas, she decides. She continues to work in the silent house, in the waning light, not bothering to rest, though her wrist has begun to ache, not bothering to get up and turn on the lamp over the table, or the lights on the lawn, or in any of the other rooms, until the telephone rings. She answers after half a ring, but it's only a telemarketer, some poor soul on weekend duty, asking reluctantly if a Mrs. Ganguly, Ashima replies tartly before hanging up. At twilight, the sky turns a pale blue, and the trees on the lawn and the shapes of the neighboring houses become silhouettes, solidly black. At 5 o'clock, her husband still hasn't called. She calls his apartment and gets no answer. She calls 10 minutes later, then 10 minutes after that. It is her own voice on the answering machine, reciting the number and asking the caller to leave a message. Each time she calls, she listens to the tone, but she doesn't leave a message. She considers the places he may have stopped on his way home. the pharmacy to pick up a prescription, the supermarket to buy food. By 6 o'clock, she can no longer distract herself by sealing and stamping the envelopes she has spent all day addressing. She calls directory assistants, asking for an operator in Cleveland, then calls the number of the hospital he told her he had gone to. She asks for the emergency room, is connected to one part of the hospital after another. "He's just there for an examination," she tells the people who answer and tell her to hold. She spells the last name as she has hundreds of times by now. G like green, N like napkin. She holds the line until she is tempted to hang up, wondering all the while if her husband is trying to reach her from home, regretting not having call waiting. She is disconnected, calls again. "Ganguly," she says. Again she is told to hold. Then a person comes on the line, a young woman's voice, no older than Sonia probably. "Yes, I do apologize for the wait. To whom am I speaking?" "Ashima Ganguly," Ashima says. "Ashok Ganguly's wife. To whom am I speaking, please?" "I see. I'm sorry, ma'am. I'm the intern who first examined your husband. I've been holding on for nearly half an hour. Is my husband still there, or has he gone?" "I'm very sorry, ma'am," the young woman repeats. "We've been trying to reach you." And then the young woman tells her that the patient, Ashok Ganguly, her husband, has expired. Expired. A word used for library cards, for magazine subscriptions. A word which, for several seconds, has no effect whatsoever on Ashima. "No, no, it must be a mistake," Ashima says calmly, shaking her head, a small laugh escaping from her throat. "My husband is not there for an emergency, only for stomachache." "I'm sorry, Mrs. Ganguly, is it?" She listens to something about a heart attack, that it had been massive, that all attempts to revive him had failed. Did she wish to have any of her husband's organs donated? She is asked. And then, is there anyone in the Cleveland area to identify and claim the body? Instead of answering, Ashima hangs up the phone as the woman is still speaking, pressing down the receiver as hard as she can into the cradle, keeping her hand there for a full minute, as if to smother the words she has just heard. She stares at her empty teacup, and then at the kettle on the stove, which she had had to turn off in order to hear her husband's voice just a few hours ago. She begins to shiver violently, the house instantly feeling 20 degrees colder. She pulls her sari tightly around her shoulders, like a shawl. She gets up and walks systematically through the rooms of the house, turning on all the light switches, turning on the lamppost on the lawn and the floodlight over the garage, as if she and Ashok are expecting company. She returns to the kitchen and stares at the pile of cards on the table in the red envelopes it had pleased her so much to buy, most of them ready to be dropped in the mailbox. Her husband's name is on all of them. She opens her address book, suddenly unable to remember her son's phone number, a thing she can normally dial in her sleep. There is no answer at his office or at his apartment, and so she tries the number she has written down for Maxine. It's listed along with the other numbers under G, both for Ganguly and for Gogol. Sonia flies back from San Francisco to be with Ashima. Gogol flies from LaGuardia to Cleveland alone. He leaves early the next morning, boarding the first flight he can get. On the plane, he stares through the window at the land below, at the snow-covered patches of the Midwest, and at curving rivers that seem covered with tin foil glinting under the sun. The plane's shape darkens a shifting length of ground. The flight is more than half empty. Men and a few women in business suits, people used to such flights and to traveling at such hours, typing on laptops or reading the news of the day. He is unaccustomed to the banality of domestic flights, the narrow cabin, the single bag he has packed, small enough to stow overhead. Maxine has offered to go with him, but he has told her no. He doesn't want to be with someone who barely knew his father, who has met him only once. She walked him to 9th Avenue, stood with him at dawn, her hair uncombed, her face still thick with sleep, her coat and a pair of boots slipped on over her pajamas. He withdrew cash from an ATM, hailed a cab. Most of the city, including Gerald and Lydia, were still asleep in their beds. He and Maxine had been at a book party for one of Maxine's writer friends the night before. Afterward, they had gone out to dinner with a small group. At about 10 o'clock, they had returned to her parents' house as usual, tired, as if it were much later, pausing on their way upstairs to say good night to Gerald and Lydia, who were sitting under a blanket on the sofa, watching a French film on video, sipping glasses of after-dinner wine. The lights had been turned off, but from the glow of the television screen, Gogol could see that Lydia was resting her head on Gerald's shoulder, that they both had their feet propped against the edge of the coffee table. "Oh, Nick, your mother called," Gerald had said, glancing up from the screen. "Twice," Lydia added. He felt a sting of embarrassment. No, she hadn't left any message, they said. His mother called him more often these days, now that she was living on her own. Every day, it seemed, she needed to hear the voices of her children. But she had never called him at Maxine's parents'. She called him at work, or left messages at his apartment that he would receive days later. He decided that whatever it was could wait until morning. "Thanks, Gerald," he'd said, his arm around Maxine's waist, turning to leave the room. But then the phone had rung again. "Hello," Gerald had said, and then to Gogol, "It's your sister this time." He takes a cab from the airport to the hospital, shocked by how much colder it is in Ohio than in New York, by the thick layer of snow that cakes the ground. The hospital is a compound of beige stone buildings situated on the crest of a softly sloping hill. He enters the same emergency room his father had entered the day before. After giving his name, he is told to take the elevator to the 6th floor and then to wait in an empty room, the walls painted a rich dark blue. He watches the clock on the wall, donated, along with the rest of the furnishings in the room, by the loving family of someone named Eugene Arthur. There are no magazines in the waiting room, no television, only a collection of matching wing chairs lined up against the walls, and a water fountain at one end. Through the glass door he sees a white hallway, a few empty hospital beds. There is little commotion, no doctors or nurses scurrying down the halls. He keeps his eyes on the elevator, half expecting his father to walk out and fetch him, to indicate, with a slight tilt of the head, that it is time to go. When the elevator doors eventually open, he sees a cart stacked with breakfast trays, most of their contents hidden under domes, and tiny cartons of milk. He feels hungry all of a sudden, wishes he had thought to save the bagel the stewardess had handed him on the plane. His last meal had been at the restaurant the night before, a bright, bustling place in Chinatown. They had waited nearly an hour on the sidewalk for their table, and then feasted on flowering chives and salted squid and the clams in the black bean sauce that Maxine loved best. They were already drunk from the book party, lazily sipping their beers, their cold cups of jasmine tea. All this time his father was in the hospital, already dead. The door opens and a short, pleasant-looking, middle-aged man with a salt and pepper beard steps into the room. He wears a white knee-length coat over his clothing and carries a clipboard. "Hello," he says, smiling kindly at Gogol. Were you my father's doctor?" "No, I'm Mr. Davenport. I'll be taking you downstairs." Mr. Davenport escorts Gogol in an elevator reserved for patients and doctors to the sub-basement of the hospital. He stands with Gogol in the morgue as a sheet is pulled back to show his father's face. The face is yellow and waxy, a thickened, oddly bloated image. The lips, nearly colorless, are set in an expression of uncharacteristic haughtiness. Below the sheet, Gogol realizes, his father is unclothed. The fact shames him, causes him to turn briefly away. When he looks again, he studies the face more closely, still thinking that perhaps it's a mistake, that a tap on his father's shoulder will wake him. The only thing that feels familiar is the mustache the excess hair on his cheeks and chin shaved less than 24 hours ago. His glasses are missing, Gogol says, looking up at Mr. Davenport. Mr. Davenport does not reply. After a few minutes, he says, "Mr. Ganguly, are you able to positively identify the body? Is this your father?" "Yes, that's him," Gogol hears himself saying. After a few moments, he realizes that a chair has been brought for him to sit in, that Mr. Davenport has stepped aside. Gogol sits down. He wonders if he should touch his father's face, lay a hand on his forehead as his father used to do to Gogol when he was unwell, to see if he had a fever, and yet he feels terrified to do so, unable to move. Eventually, with his index finger, he grazes his father's mustache, an eyebrow, a bit of the hair on his head, for those parts of him he knows are still quietly living. Mr. Davenport asks Gogol if he is ready, and then the sheet is replaced, and he is led from the room. A resident arrives, explaining exactly how and when the heart attack happened, why there was nothing the doctors could do. Gogol is given the clothes his father had been wearing: navy slacks, a white shirt with brown stripes, a grey LL Bean sweater, vest that Gogol and Sonia had gotten him for Christmas one year, dark brown socks, light brown shoes, his glasses, a trench coat and a scarf. The items brim to the top of a large paper shopping bag. There is a book in the pocket of the trench coat, a copy of The Comedians by Graham Greene, with yellow pages and tiny print. Opening the cover, he sees that the book had been bought used. A stranger's name, Roy Goodwin, is written inside. In a separate envelope, he is given his father's wallet, his car keys. He tells the hospital that no religious services are necessary, is told that the ashes would be ready in a few days. He could pick them up personally at the funeral home the hospital suggests, or have them sent, along with the death certificate, directly to Pemberton Road. Before leaving, he asks to see the exact place in the emergency room his father was last alive. The bed number is looked up on the chart. A young man with his arm in a sling lies in it now, otherwise in good spirits, talking on the telephone. Gogol glimpses the curtains that had partly girded his father when life left him. Green and grey flowers with a section of white mesh at the top. Metal hooks hang from the ceiling, travelling on a white U-shaped rail. His father's leased car, described to him by his mother on the telephone last night, is still parked in the visitors' parking lot. AM news fills his ears as soon as he turns on the ignition, startling him. His father had always been particular about turning off the radio at the car at the end of a drive. In fact, there is no sign of his father in the car, no maps or scraps of paper, no empty cups or loose change or receipts. All he finds in the glove compartment is the registration and the owner's manual. He spends a few minutes reading through the manual, comparing the features of the dashboard to the illustration in the book. He turns the wipers on and off and tests the headlights, even though it's still daylight. He shuts off the radio, drives in silence through the cold, bleak afternoon, through the flat, charmless town he will never visit again. He follows directions a nurse at the hospital gave him to the apartment where his father had lived, wondering if this route is the same one his father had taken when he drove himself to the hospital. Each time he passes a restaurant, he considers turning off the road, but then he finds himself in a residential section. Blocks of Victorian mansions on snow-covered lawns, sidewalks covered with lacy patches of ice. His father's apartment is part of a complex called Baron's Court. Beyond the gate, oversized silver mailboxes, spacious enough to hold a month's worth of mail, stand in a row. A man outside the first of the buildings, marked "Rental Office," nods to him as he drives past, seeming to recognize the car. Has he mistaken him for his father? Gogol wonders, the thought comforting. The only thing to distinguish each building is a number and a name. To either side of it are more units, absolutely identical, each 3 stories tall, arranged around a vast looping road. Tudor facades, tiny metal balconies, wood chips under the stairs. The relentless uniformity of it upsets him profoundly, more so than even the hospital and the sight of his father's face. Thinking of his father living here alone these past 3 months, he feels the first threat of tears. But he knows that his father did not mind, that he was not offended by such things. He parks in front of his father's building, remaining long enough in the car to see an elderly, sprightly couple emerge with tennis rackets. He remembers his father telling him that the residents are mostly retired or divorced. There are paths for walking, a small exercise complex, a man-made pond surrounded by benches and willow trees. His father's apartment is on the 2nd floor. He unlocks the door, takes off his shoes, puts them on the plastic runner that his father must have placed there to protect the plush off-white wall-to-wall carpeting. He sees a pair of his father's sneakers and a pair of lip-lops for wearing around the house. The door opens onto a spacious living room with a sliding glass door to the right, a kitchen to the left. Nothing hangs on the freshly painted ivory walls. The kitchen is separated on one side by a half wall, one of the things his mother always wanted in their own house, so that it would be possible to cook and still see and speak to people in another room. Against the refrigerator is a picture of himself and his mother and Sonia, behind a magnet from a local bank. They are standing at Fatehpur Sikri with clothes tied over their feet to protect them from the hot stone surface. He was a freshman in high school, thin and glum. Sonia was just a girl, his mother in a salwar kameez, something she was too shy to wear in front of their relatives in Calcutta, who always expected her to be in a sari. He opens the cupboards, first the ones above the countertop, then the ones below. Most of them are empty. He finds 4 plates, 2 mugs, 4 glasses. In a drawer he finds 1 knife and 2 forks, a pattern recognizable from home. In another cupboard are a box of tea bags, Peak Friens shortbread biscuits, a 5-pound bag of sugar that has not been poured into a bowl, a tin of evaporated milk. There are several small bags of yellow split peas and a large plastic bag of rice. A rice cooker sits mindfully unplugged on the counter. The ledge of the stove is lined with a few spice jars, labeled in his mother's hand. Below the sink, he finds a bottle of Windex, a box of trash bags, a single sponge. He walks through the rest of the apartment. Behind the living room is a small bedroom with nothing in it but a bed, and across from it a windowless bathroom. A jar of Pond's cold cream, his father's lifelong answer to aftershave, sits at the side of the sink. He goes to work immediately, going through the room and putting things into garbage bags. The spices, cold cream, the issue of Time magazine by his father's bed. "Don't bring anything back," his mother had told him on the phone. "It's not our way." He lingers over nothing at first, but in the kitchen he pauses. He feels guilty throwing out the food. Were it his father in his place, he would have packed the spare rice and tea bags into his suitcase. His father had abhorred waste of any kind, to the point where he complained to Ashima if a kettle had been filled with too much water. On his first trip to the basement, Gogol sees a table on which other tenants have left things up for grabs: books, videotapes, a white casserole with clear glass lid. Soon the table is filled with his father's handheld vacuum, the rice cooker, the tape player, the television, the curtains still attached to their collapsible plastic rods. From the bag he had bought back from the hospital, he saves his father's wallet containing $40, 3 credit cards, a wad of receipts, photographs of Gogol and Sonia when they were babies. He saves the photograph on the fridge.